The city had made a habit of forgetting. Every winter, the streets grew a little harsher, and the people fighting to survive beneath the bridges grew a little more invisible. People walked past them without stopping, without wondering how anyone ends up there. Almost no one stopped, except Claire. She was not someone who could look away from a person who was hungry or cold. The market had 1 hour left before closing. Vendors were already folding their stalls, and a hardening wind was pushing everyone home. On the edge of the sidewalk, a man sat quietly wrapped in a worn blanket. Not long ago, people who saw him in a tailored suit could have said his name without hesitation. Now those same people turned their heads to avoid meeting his eyes. His overgrown beard, his hands cracked from the cold, and the small box of coins in front of him were enough for the world to pass its judgment. Nathaniel Cross watched everything around him as though he were looking at a world that no longer belonged to him. This life had not been forced on him. He had chosen it himself. 3 months earlier, the partner he had trusted most for years had betrayed him, and by the next morning the papers had already crowned him a symbol of failure. He had won the lawsuit, but what he had lost wasn't money. It was his trust in people, and that had never come back. So he had set his well-known name aside, wanting to see with his own eyes how people treated someone they believed was worth nothing at all. Claire was gathering the last loaf of bread from her stall when her eyes landed on the man at the edge of the sidewalk. She had no idea that the man in front of her had built one of the largest logistics companies in the country. She only saw someone who might not survive the cold that night. Without a second thought, she walked over, crouched down, and held out the bread. "Take this," she said gently. "You shouldn't go hungry in this weather." Nathaniel said nothing for a few seconds. It was as if no one had truly spoken to him in a long time. Finally, he lifted his head and answered in a cracked voice, "1 sentence, nothing more. Thank you." Claire didn't turn to leave. The brief silence of someone still deciding something settled between them. "It's going to get much colder tonight," she said. "Where are you staying?" "Under the bridge on 5th Street. Claire took a deep breath. "My home isn't much," she said, "but it's warm. You can stay with us tonight if you want. You can leave early in the morning. No one needs to know." That was the exact moment everything changed. Claire had no idea the man beside her was Nathaniel Cross. Beneath the worn clothes, the silence, the life of the streets, was the founder of one of the country's largest corporations. The neighbors in her building would have laughed if they'd known. To them, Nathaniel was just a nameless stranger Claire had taken pity on. Before long, the whole neighborhood would be buzzing with the rumor that the young woman had brought a beggar into her home. Claire was 27. Since losing her father 5 years earlier, she had carried the full weight of her family's needs on her own shoulders. By day, she worked as a seamstress, and with every coin she earned, she tried to provide for her mother, Margaret, and her younger sister, Lily. Their modest 3-room home was always filled with the hum of sewing machines and the smell of fabric. Nathaniel had only meant to stay 1 night, but that night turned into the next day, and the next day turned into a full week. Over time, Nathaniel became part of the household's quiet rhythm. He fixed the leaking faucet, patiently walked Lily through her math problems, tidied the kitchen without being asked, washed the dishes, and took on whatever needed doing around the house. No one questioned his past. Claire was curious, but she chose not to push. One evening over tea, she was the first to break the silence. "I've never asked you why you were out there," she said. "But if you ever want to tell me, I'm ready to listen." Nathaniel said nothing for a long moment. When he looked into Claire's eyes, he didn't see pity. There was compassion, but no contempt. She treated him not like someone the street had discarded, but like an ordinary person, and in that moment, Nathaniel realized he was facing something he hadn't encountered in years. Something rare. Something valuable. As the days Nathaniel spent in that house stretched on, the whispers around the neighborhood grew louder. People loved filling in stories they didn't actually know with their own imaginations. Old acquaintances who spotted Nathaniel at the market walked past without recognizing him or exchanged mocking smiles behind his back. Before long, everyone was saying the same thing. Claire had taken a beggar into her home. Within days, the rumor had grown so large that some were even claiming the young woman was preparing to marry him. No one was affected by this more than Lily. One afternoon, she came home from school in tears. She dropped her bag by the door and, barely holding herself together, threw her arms around her sister. "Everyone made fun of me today," she said between sobs. "They said you're going to marry a beggar." Claire immediately knelt down beside her. She wiped her sister's tears and spoke in a calm voice. "It doesn't matter what other people say, Lily, but everyone believes it. Don't judge people by what's in their pockets. If you want to know someone, look at how they treat others." Lily listened quietly. "Has Nathaniel done a single unkind thing to us since he arrived?" The little girl shook her head. "He fixed the faucet. He helped with your lessons. He walked out in the rain to get Mom's medicine. He cleans the kitchen without anyone asking. Can someone who does all that be a bad person?" Lily took a deep breath. "No." "Then hold on to what you've seen with your own eyes. Not what other people are saying." After that conversation, Lily smiled for the first time that day. But not everyone in the house shared Claire's way of thinking. Margaret had entirely different plans for her daughter's future. In her eyes, feelings were a luxury only the poor could afford. Real life, she believed, was built on security and money. That was exactly why she had spent months quietly meeting with Gerald Whitfield. Gerald was a wealthy contractor behind some of the city's biggest developments. He appeared respectable on the surface, but in business circles his name was frequently linked to questionable deals. None of that mattered to Margaret. All she cared about was that Gerald's son, Preston Whitfield, had taken an interest in Claire. One evening over dinner, she finally brought it up. "Preston is seriously interested in you." Claire looked at her mother in disbelief. "Where is this coming from?" "His father spoke to me." Claire's expression changed instantly. "Mom, I don't even know Preston." "You will." "I don't want to know him." Margaret's voice hardened. "Why not?" "Because I don't trust him." "Based on what?" "Sometimes you can tell enough just by looking into someone's eyes." Margaret exhaled deeply. "Claire, this family has been drowning in debt for years." "I know. If you marry Preston, everything could change." Claire shook her head. Slowly, "I don't want to make a deal. This isn't a deal. It feels like one to me." Margaret was starting to lose her. "Patience. Love doesn't pay the bills." Claire stayed silent. "Life isn't a fairy tale. I'm not asking for a fairy tale." "Then why are you defending that man?" Claire thought for a moment. "Because Nathaniel has never once lied to me." Margaret turned away with a mocking smile. "What could that man possibly give you?" Claire looked her mother directly in the eyes. "Maybe he has no money." "Exactly, but he has character." That sentence changed the entire atmosphere in the room. Margaret said nothing more. But from that night on, she was certain of one thing. Nathaniel had to leave the house. What no one expected happened only a few days later. Close to midnight, Margaret suddenly clutched her chest, struggling to breathe. Her face had gone pale, and her hands were shaking uncontrollably. Claire froze, unsure what to do. Lily burst into tears. Panic swept through the house in seconds. In the middle of the chaos, only one person remained calm. Nathaniel. He moved to Margaret's, sighed without hesitation. "Try to control your breathing." He turned to Claire. "Call an ambulance." His voice carried such certainty that no one thought to question him. Nathaniel assessed Margaret's condition carefully, administered basic first aid, and when he realized the ambulance would take too long, he asked a neighbor to borrow a car. Minutes later, he was the one who drove her to the hospital himself. Hours later, the doctor said that if she hadn't been treated in time, the outcome could have been far worse. In her hospital room, Margaret stared at Nathaniel for a long while in silence. Finally, she couldn't hold back her curiosity. "You—" Nathaniel raised his head. "Where did you learn all of that?" There was a brief pause. Then he answered calmly, "I once had a very different life." Margaret listened closely. "That life taught me more than I ever expected it to." Nathaniel offered no further explanation, but for the first time, Margaret began to consider that the man in front of her might not be just an ordinary man who had lived on the streets. She still didn't know the truth, but every assumption she'd held was beginning, slowly, to crack. Margaret's view of Nathaniel had started to shift. She didn't say it out loud, but she no longer saw him as simply a stranger staying in their home. Yet during those same days, someone else was far from pleased with how things were unfolding. Gerald Whitfield. Noticing that Claire continued to keep her distance from Preston, Gerald had no intention of letting his plans fall apart. If the young woman wouldn't agree to the marriage on her own, then the terms would have to change. So he went directly to Margaret. At a quiet restaurant, he placed a thick folder in front of her. Inside, every one of the family's debts was listed in detail. "I can clear all of this," Gerald said, his voice calm and calculated. Margaret stared at the folder in shock. "All of it? You won't pay a single cent." Her eyes lit up with hope. "What do you want in return?" Gerald smiled faintly. "Your daughter marries Preston." The hope on Margaret's face briefly gave way to hesitation. "Claire won't agree to that." "She will." "You don't know her." "No," Gerald said. "I know people well." He leaned in closer over the table. "And that man staying in your house." He didn't say Nathaniel's name directly. "Will be completely out of the picture." Margaret said nothing for a long time. The debt had weighed on her shoulders for years, like something she carried everywhere. What she chose in that moment would shape not only her own future, but her daughter's life as well. And in the end, she chose wrong. From that day forward, everything moved according to plan. Whenever Nathaniel tried to speak with Claire, Margaret would find a way to interrupt, always inventing some reason to send the young woman out of the room. One morning, she quietly took Claire's phone and hid it. When Nathaniel called, there was no answer. That same day, Margaret called Nathaniel into the kitchen. "Claire doesn't want to see you." Nathaniel looked at her, stunned. "Why?" "She didn't explain it to me." The woman held his gaze without wavering. "She's grateful to you, but she wants you to leave now." A deep disappointment settled over Nathaniel's face. Did she really say that herself? Yes. A long silence followed. Nathaniel couldn't understand why Claire would do this. Still, he didn't want to force the issue. "I understand." That night, he left the house without waking anyone. The next morning, when Claire found his room empty, she didn't understand what had happened. She ran to her mother. "Where's Nathaniel?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "He's gone." "Gone?" "Yes." "Why?" "He left without saying a single word." Claire's face went pale. "He didn't even tell me." "No." The young woman refused to believe it. She called him for hours. She couldn't reach him. She went to the market. She checked under the bridge. She couldn't find anyone who knew him. Nathaniel had disappeared as though he'd never existed at all. For days, Claire kept trying to understand why. She didn't want to believe he would leave without any explanation, but she had no other truth to hold on to. It was around this time that Margaret sped up the wedding preparations. The debts were being cleared one by one, and Preston's family was overseeing every last detail. Claire felt as though she'd been trapped inside invisible walls. She could neither convince her mother nor reach Nathaniel. At last, the wedding day arrived. The hall had been prepared to suit one of the wealthiest families in the city, Crystal. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Live music filled the air, and guests in expensive attire mingled and exchanged pleasantries. In the middle of all that spectacle, only one person was not happy: Claire. She stood in her white gown, but there wasn't the faintest trace of excitement in her eyes. As the officiant made his final preparations, Preston greeted guests with a confident smile. Claire, meanwhile, couldn't stop glancing at the door, as though she still believed, somehow, a miracle might walk through it. Just before the ceremony began, she took a deep breath. Then she spoke, clearly enough for the entire room to hear. "I don't want this marriage." The hall fell into instant silence. Preston turned to her, stunned. The color drained from Margaret's face. "Claire," she whispered. The young woman didn't back down. "My heart belongs to someone else." Preston's smile disappeared. Margaret rose to her feet in anger. "Are you talking about that beggar?" Claire held her mother's gaze without flinching. "Yes. That man has nothing." Claire's voice was steadier this time. "Maybe he has no money in his pockets." Every guest in the room was listening now. But the character he has is worth more than most of the people standing in this room. At that exact moment, the great doors of the hall slowly opened. The man who walked in was not the man who had sat on the sidewalk weeks earlier in an old coat. He wore a flawlessly tailored dark suit. Behind him walked a professional security team and company executives. Every conversation in the room cut off at once. Everyone was looking at the same person. Nathaniel Cross had returned. When the heavy doors of the hall swung open, every conversation inside stopped instantly. The man who entered was the same person, who had sat on the street weeks earlier in worn-out clothes. But now he wore a flawlessly tailored dark suit. Behind him walked a professional security team and company executives. As the room stared in shock, Nathaniel moved forward with slow, deliberate steps. Claire's eyes filled with tears. Nathaniel. He gave her a brief look, a look that held both longing and regret. Gerald Whitfield took a few steps back. The confidence on his face vanished within seconds. He stammered. "That's not possible." Nathaniel stopped and began speaking, his voice calm. "My name is Nathaniel Cross." A deep silence fell over the room. Some of you know me from business. People began glancing at each other. The expressions of those who recognized the name shifted at once. "I am the founder and chairman of Cross Logistics International." Whispers rose across the room after those words. Preston's face had gone completely white. Margaret stood frozen where she was. Nathaniel continued. 3 months ago, I decided to leave everything I had behind. No one dared to interrupt him. For years, I lived surrounded by success, money, and status. But there was one question I never had the answer to. He let his gaze move slowly across the room. Did people love me for who I truly was, or only for what I owned? The silence in the hall grew even heavier. That's why I hid my name. Claire never looked away from him. I lived on the street. I asked for help. I watched how people saw me. He took a deep breath. Most people just walked past. Some pitied me. Some didn't even notice I existed. Then a faint smile appeared on his face. But one person stopped. Nathaniel looked directly at Claire. She never asked who I was. She never wondered how much money I had. She never tried to dig into my past. She just saw someone who was cold. Claire could no longer hold back her tears. She gave me her bread. She opened the door to her home, and she wanted nothing in return. For the first time, Nathaniel's voice trembled slightly. In my life, I've closed deals worth billions of dollars, but that small act of kindness shown to me was worth more than all of it. Many of the guests in the room lowered their heads. Nathaniel turned to Gerald. But this wasn't only about learning who people were. The tension on Gerald's face deepened. I was watching you, too. What do you mean? Nathaniel's voice turned cold again. The falsified documents used in your recent municipal projects. The irregular payments. The shell companies. Gerald's breathing quickened. All the evidence was handed over to the authorities months ago. At that exact moment, the hall doors opened once more. This time, uniformed police officers walked in. The guests stepped aside in shock. One officer walked straight up to Gerald Whitfield. The officer held up an official document. You are under arrest on charges of fraud, forgery of official documents, and corruption in public contracts. Gerald looked around as though searching for a way out. This is a mistake. No one answered him. As the handcuffs closed around his wrists, Preston stepped back. Moments earlier, the confident young man had looked untouchable. Now he slipped quietly into the crowd and out of the hall. No one stopped him. After the police led Gerald away, silence settled over the room once more. Nathaniel slowly walked over to stand in front of Claire. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as though everything they hadn't been able to say for weeks lived inside that silence. Finally, Nathaniel spoke first. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth." Claire listened quietly. "I didn't do it to deceive you. I needed to know how I'd be treated without everything I had." There was a brief pause. "You're the one who taught me that." Claire smiled faintly. "I was never looking for a rich man." Nathaniel lowered his head. "I know. I just saw a good person." Nathaniel's eyes welled up. "That's exactly why." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box. The room held its breath. Nathaniel dropped to one knee. "Claire, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Claire's face as she said a single word. "Yes." The silence in the hall broke into applause. Margaret walked slowly toward her daughter. She made no effort to hide her tears. "Claire," her voice was shaking, "I thought I was protecting you." She lowered her head. "But I never really tried to listen to you." She turned to Nathaniel. "And I judged you by what was in your pockets." She took a deep breath. "Can you both forgive me?" Claire embraced her mother. "We all make mistakes. What matters is whether we learn from them." When the wedding took place months later, it wasn't held in a grand hotel or a luxurious estate. At Nathaniel's request, the ceremony was held in the old market square where they had first met. The corner where Claire had once handed him bread and helped him without expecting anything in return was carefully preserved. A small bronze plaque was placed at the edge of the square. It bore a single line. "Here, a person taught me that true wealth was never about money." Life often measures people by what they possess, but true character reveals itself only when every title, every fortune, and every appearance falls away. Because a person's worth is not measured by what's in their pocket, but by the hand they extend to another without expecting anything back. And sometimes, a small act of kindness, given quietly, is worth more than the greatest fortune in the world.